Another draft physics video presentation. So, I guess we'll go over the, foundational bits. There's two arguments here that are pretty well established. An argument regarding gravity and an argument regarding light interference and any notion that light does in fact interfere with light. And that all the experiments that seem to indicate that, and they only seem to, have been grossly distorted. I mean, I'd say misinterpreted, but it's really not a misinterpretation when for 200 years you claim something that's kind of overtly not true. I mean, I can show it right over there. What I've done is offered to have the conversation, the debate, the argument with people who are claiming otherwise, and yet no one will show up for that argument. They won't provide me a link to any good physics demonstrating that I'm wrong, and I can't pay them, to defend their physics, their science, their argument, their understanding, I guess their philosophy. So I'm offering $1,700 to one of these science channels on YouTube that are doing all of this propagandizing for quantum, or showing how smart they are by beating up flat earthers and all of that crap. All of this, whatever, pop culture science. And no takers. I've attempted, somebody suggested tutors. Well, I've attempted, now twice now. The Hassan Beam person has a whole website devoted to this pay a tutor kind of thing, and they wouldn't even respond. Clearly they don't have much advantage in being made fools of as tutors. It's not going to do them much good, to be shown to be doing fake and phony and false science. And this is really just this bad. I mean, I've pointed out that the Young experiment is 200 years old, and it was wrong the day he drew it. It wasn't getting the right pattern, because you can't do the math from the center of the openings, two waves. You can't do it that way. It won't work. Won't give you the right pattern. Only in in 1% of the cases you'll get a number that's close, but it's only in 1% of all the variations you could do with the experiment in terms of how big the impediment is and how wide the slits are. So if you make the slits so preposterously narrow that you can't even cut them, they're so small, yes, theoretically your pattern will be so little off, there'll be so little difference between the distances that you'll negate any substantial viewable difference. But that's it. It's a silly case that you can't even, as a practical matter, produce. So anyway, as I've demonstrated, the Feynman videos are just absolute garbage, and he was the father of electrodynamics, this whole understanding or science of what light does when it interacts with matter, and most specifically when it interacts with electrons. That's the substance of it. And it's just terribly flawed. All the math is based on some notion of sine waves, that these patterns are created in some sort of proportional manner. As I pointed out for years, in photons, the double slit experiment has no appearance of going gradually on and then gradually off and then gradually on and gradually off like it's supposed to. It doesn't look like that. And it doesn't look like that in other experiments, thin film ones, for example, over there. There are bands of light, as Feynman says. So he sees them as bands of light, right? And yet he calculates them, all right, as something that is more ribbon or bars in the sense of round. I don't even know how to describe it, but they're not really bands of light and dark in the math. The math says something different. The math they do. What little they do. frankly. And there's not. You can just look at it, and you can deduce some things that just make what they're saying impossible. Not practical, not likely to be the truth. And it kind of just says, yeah, there's only one real option here, is that light is more complicated than they're saying. That it's not just about measuring an intensity, it's about understanding what the light did to get to that intensity, or however you want to put it. So what you can see from this is just two flat pieces of glass, and the trick is the glass is unyielding, so when you put the two pieces together, there's a little bit of dust or dirt, and the glass will tip in some direction. Because it's really, really flat, you can only tip one way, and so that's why you get very straight lines, is because it's flat glass and it can only tip one way, and that's it, and the light is coming straight down. So you get these very straight lines as Newton's rings, but it's obviously not ringing. And you get this light and dark pattern that physics just says every time they see it, they have to say the word interference. And yeah, again, I'm arguing that the counter theories, all the theories not considered, well, one of them would be that no, you break light and then you remake light, which isn't a very complex reach. I mean, you're not stepping into some sort of bent space theory or adding extra dimensions or entanglement by suggesting that this idea that light somehow interacts with light is stupid, and the idea that light interacts with surface is smart. And you have, in this case, you have the first surface, and then you have the two surfaces of where the air gap is, and it's the air gap surfaces, surface number 2 and 3, that are generating this extra potential to see light. And you can sort of get that because viewing it at an angle, so you're viewing, the light's coming straight down, the lenses look like they're straight, but they're obviously not. So you're looking at that from an angle, and from that angle you can see that the top surface isn't producing any reflections that you can see. So clearly whatever light is reflecting off the top surface, it's reflecting at some angle you're not going to see it from. So it's not going to different locations, it's going straight back. And the other two surfaces are the ones that are producing light that's going in all the directions, so therefore we can see it from this direction, from this angle. And what you can see from it is, again, that it's really has to be made out of the light on the bottom surface. It can't be made, the pattern, what we're seeing can't be coming from the top surface, because it's not, there isn't any indication of that through the edge. The edge, you can see that there's no bands across the top surface, and the light's really being generated by the bottom surface. Now the argument is that the top surface is making a contribution, but that's the whole point. The contribution is broken. It's in pieces. So you can't see it as photons. It's lost its coherency as a pattern. And it's the bottom surfaces, the two of them, that are producing the extra photons, the pieces that are combining with the top pieces and making the pattern. And so it's the same argument in the double slit experiment. And you get kind of the same effect in the sense it gets much brighter. So if you have one slit open, it makes a certain amount of light, 1. Then you open another slit over here and it makes a certain amount of light, 1. But when you have both of them open, you have 4 times that amount of light, or 3 point something times, because some light just doesn't work because of different factors, but whatever. And in this case, some of the light is actually reflected. A percentage of the light isn't getting to the bottom surface, and a percentage of that light isn't getting to the next surface, because it doesn't transmit 100% of the light, because obviously it's reflecting some portion of the light. Some photons are getting broken, and some of them you won't ever put back together again. So you're always going to have less light than you started with. All right. And again, just you have to remember that you're viewing it through one little tiny pupil, that the real world is so much brighter than you can appreciate because of the fact that you have a little tiny pupil that's only seeing one tiny piece, one tiny location, the amount of photons that are going to one single location, but the light's going to all these other places also. So everything that looks a certain brightness, well, it's really so much brighter. Millions of times brighter, I don't know. I mean, it's a lot brighter. You just can't appreciate it because you're only looking at one tiny piece, one portion of the light it's actually producing. This isn't, these aren't difficult observations, little things to keep in mind, little points that make it kind of clear, that we're really not talking about what they say is happening is not a good answer, that there's other answers that take into account all of what you're observing as an effect. Even the very subtle reflection, if you look at the bottom reflection through the really thick lens, it also has some little stripes in it, but that's the reflection of the light bouncing back, so it's seeing a pattern also. If you had an eyeball down there, you could see also that you're going to get some pattern back off the reflection off the bottom surface. But anyway, and that's going to have a pattern in it also. It's going to be doing the same thing, just in reverse with much less light. So it's very faint because it's doing the same thing with much less light. Well, it's not that much less. Obviously, most of the light just goes straight through, so you can understand, but it's obviously been diminished somewhat, and now you're seeing the pattern as it's reflected off of a surface, which is the same thing we're doing, but you can understand it can only affect the surface that is already lit up. It can only make it so much brighter, and so it's harder to see because you're casting that light on a surface that has full vision of the light bulb, so to speak. We have the advantage where we can't see the light bulb behind this, so obviously we don't have the conflicting amount of photons coming back at us to make it a lot harder to see, where the bottom surface does. It's looking right into the light bulb, and so that's why it's very faint. So anyway, I don't know how much of that you can see. It doesn't really matter. You can go look at it for yourself. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. And again, the math is all wrong in this video. It's all sine wave math. The pattern clearly isn't a sine wave, so I don't know why they keep saying it is, or keep arguing or keep defending that notion when that's not what it's doing. It's clearly very consistent across most of the light, is very consistent, and only at the edges is it's a little bit blurry, so it's a square wave with a fuzzy edge maybe, but it's certainly not a sine wave. Alright, what else to say? Yeah, so I mean, obviously the argument I'm making is photons are a pattern of a frequency, and the wavelength is significant, and that part of their math is correct. This is all about putting things back in alignment, and back in phase. And when you do that, you recreate photons, and when you don't do that, you don't recreate a photon. You just have noise. You just have a signal, but it doesn't receivable. And I've made the example. Another example that clearly should be saying something to physicists is the fact that all of their other two source experiments, the ones they do with radio or radar, can all be explained as jamming. It's a simple explanation. You're jamming the signal. When you have two of the same frequency radio signals and you put them out of phase, you can't receive either one of them, unless you have a directional antenna that excludes as much radiation from the other source as possible. So unless you exclude, allowing both of them to hit, jamming is a perfectly valid explanation for what you're seeing. And yet they'll go for the extraordinary explanation that somehow, even without slits, even without surfaces, even without some obstacle course to screw up and create entanglements and superpositions and all of this wackiness, even without those things in the experiment, they're claiming that you're bouncing photons off of photons, or somehow photons are canceling each other. Somehow energy is destroying energy, because that's really what photons are. They're a force. They move the speed of force. I mean, even these simple arguments, it'd be interesting just to hear somebody make some sort of counter argument how it's right that physics keeps saying the speed of light when they've pretty much conclusively proven that it's really the speed of force. That all the little stuff that's invisible, magnetism, gravity, and light, all of it moves the same speed. So why is it the speed of light and not the speed of force? Because it really is just forces that move this speed. I mean, these are, again, they never fixed the plus and minus thing, okay? It's been broken for 300 years and they just don't think it matters enough to fix it. And, it's too much trouble. I mean, it's wrong. It creates completely backward math. It breaks some of their most sacred math, Maxwell's equations, in the sense that you end up having current traveling in the opposite direction of voltage in a wire, which makes absolutely no sense. That you can sort of deduce that just can't be how it works. Whatever's going through the wire has got a direction, and it's only one direction at a time. Okay, it's going that way or it's going that way. It's not going both ways. Except the alternating current, of course. Blah, blah, blah. Alright, so do I need to say anything more on this specific subject? Well, I'll think about it and see if there's any other point I need to raise. I don't even know if I need to bother drawing. I mean, there's really no point, right? At this point, you people are like Trumpers or something, right? I mean, you won't concede and you won't argue. I mean, you won't prove your case that, 5 million votes were cheat votes in the election or whatever, and yet you'll just claim, but you won't defend it. It's just terrible. So you won't make the counter argument, and you won't concede that this argument is good, that this is just as valid an explanation of the reality. That you lost the election. Alright, do a little bit of positive arguing for the simpler, better explanation for what light is and what happens when it interacts with obstacles, no matter what they're made out of. So I'm arguing that photons are a composite object, that a certain number of events has to take place, that essentially a photon would be, I would argue you could liken it to, okay, it has to cause effects like electricity. That's how we detect photons. So they're basically a sequence of impulses, events. So let's just say 3 for the sake of argument. That you have to have 3 of these events, and the events have to take place over a certain area of space. That's the polarization of the light. So we know that the polarization is proportional to the frequency. That is, the alignment of these little bits is, they're out of alignment as much as they are, out of phase. They're at a different time. And that would be logically, you could understand that would be a consequence of the electricity traveling through atoms at the same rate that it's producing a force. The electricity is almost going the same speed as the force is leaving, and therefore there'd be a proportional relationship between the two. And I'm arguing that what we receive as a photon is a certain amount of space it has to hit. That's the rule. And so blue light, high frequencies have to hit small amounts of space. Red light can hit bigger pieces of space, and you can go higher and higher and more space that you can have the energy hit. And what the energy is really doing is, let's say the first bit hits a location, and that creates momentum away from that location and the other atoms. And then the second bit hits, and that one okay, pushes that even more. That impulse is hit again in this direction, and that's the initiation of an electric current, in the sense that now you've given the electron enough momentum to push it out of the atoms. So if the atoms were just pushing electrons against electrons, say the electron started here, and this electron pushed this way, it would push against this electron that way, but it's not free. So the next electron the next piece of the photon comes along and it hits here at the right timing, okay, for this event to have gotten to that location. So this event takes a little bit of time to go through these atoms, and it hits this one while the event is happening. So the first one triggered an event. The event takes time to happen, travel through some atoms, and then the next event happens, and that one's going to take advantage of the first event by causing a second event to something that's already having the first event happen, and that's what liberates the electron and forces the electric current. So that would be an explanation. It might not be the true one, might not be entirely true, might be partially true. It doesn't really matter. The point is that explains what we see, okay, better than the theory the rest of the universe seems to wish to cling, the universe of human intellectia seems to want to cling to, which is just overtly not correct. So what's really happening when things interact with surfaces is these photons within a certain range of size are being scattered. Okay, so this one might bounce off the surface. This, it hits a proton instead of an electron. Okay, this one hits an electron. This one hits another electron in some other position and starts going that way. Okay, so they're going to different places. They're being disarranged, and the real trick is can I put them back together again? That is, in the right sequence. And obviously the sequence is dependent on a distance argument. Obviously a photon could go to the surface, bounce off, and this could have whole numbers of wavelengths of time, okay, so that it ends up doing exactly what it needs to do. That is, it ends up putting them back in the right timed sequence. So there were pieces from different photons, and the pieces are rearranged into another photon. That's now, we call it a photon, but I mean they have nothing to do with each other. They just happen to be momentum at the right frequency, and that is in the right amount of space, so it can cause an electrical current. It's going to hit at the right time when it arrives to hit some new atoms. It's going to hit at a right distance from each other. Okay, from the first thing hits, and you can, like I said, you can just understand that momentum goes in all directions. And the second one just has to hit at some location that's the right distance from that center. So it's like a nuclear bomb, right? You could blow up a nuclear bomb, and then as the shock wave's moving, you could blow up another bomb, okay, and push that shock wave even faster. And that's sort of the theory. So in one place you have a much bigger explosion forward than you have at any of the other locations, because your second nuclear bomb would be against your first one in one direction, so it's not going to create more energy, it's going to create less visible energy, because the two forces will be fighting against each other. But in the direction that it's pushing, the car's already moving, and it's going to move it faster because it's going to blow up behind it. So it's kind of like that kind of a theory, right? I could make it into a car theory. Let me try that. This does not work when it's not wet. Yeah, okay. So if this was about, cars, and I just had cars pointed in different directions, I'm going to just use 4 for simplicity, and I explode something there, and so now the cars are rolling, and they're all going to roll about the same speed, you could understand. And now, a certain amount of time later, but also a certain amount of distance away, one of the cars, I push again. I have another explosion to push it along. You can understand that car is now going to go much faster. So these cars have a certain speed that's going to be not constructively affected by this action. This one's going to definitely be constructively, and that's going to be an electric current eventually. The cause of some sort of electric stimulus that we can detect, and then we'll call it a photon, because that's what we do. Our eye is saying a certain energy has to hit in a certain way, and then we see a certain color, we see a certain, and we have an impression. But there's lots of stuff hitting that's not making that impression. It doesn't create this thing, 70 miles an hour. It doesn't create the speed necessary for us to see, for us to say it's a fast car. If it's going less than 70, we don't see it. It's just noise, is the point. Alright, I think that's enough. I'll think about it and decide whether it's enough. Alright, so I guess I'll just summarize by pointing out that this is all so simple in the sense of the simple mistake, I don't know, the stupid prejudice that exists, where people have this notion that frequency and wavelength and period and all these things are owned by all of these things that have to be waves, and that these same words, frequency and period and even wavelength, you can have a wavelength of the distance between any two events and call it a wavelength. Now, it's not a wavelength when it's bullets, but it's clearly a length between bullets. So even the language is a little prejudiced, and one of the fundamental ways of measuring events is biased in the sense that we call it a wavelength instead of calling it a distance between events, distance between bullets, distance between bits of momentum. So instead of using a more universally applicable word, they use words that have that are completely biased to one kind of event. Even the word diffraction, the word diffraction to me always sort of fit that, yes, that means anytime you spread stuff. It wasn't wave exclusive, but clearly some of these physicists think the word is exclusive to only wave phenomenon and that nothing else actually does diffract. So scatter could never be called diffraction, when I always kind of understood that, yes, scatter's in the category of diffraction events that cause spreading, obviously. But that's all this is really, the foundations of this is this huge bias towards not understanding that frequency is quite independent of waves, that there are probably just as many events that have frequency that are wave-based as there are events that are individual discrete events that don't have anything to do with a wave. Like geysers, for example, or suns blowing up. Lots of events that are on a cycle that don't have anything to do with any wave creating the cycle. All right. So it's just a huge bias in the language and all, because this really is about, it's about time and distance and, frequency is very, very important to, in phase, things being in phase, things being able to add constructively to a system versus destructive. So we're back to the, adding energy to a pendulum. You can't do it unless you hit it with the right frequency. You have to be in phase with the motion of the pendulum, or you'll take energy out of the system instead of putting energy into the system. And that's all this is about. And they're cheating the physics by forcing everything to be seen through wave glasses. It's a horrible mistake. Anyway, that'll be all, folks. Till the next time. I just don't, like I said, if nobody's going to show up to defend, and what you're going to get is just ignored for pointing out their mistakes, you know, not much I can do. I can only reason. I can't make you reasonable.